In the final winter of the Second World War, as snow blanketed the ruins of Europe, Allied commanders began to realize that the war against Germany was no longer a question of if, but of who would arrive where first. The collapse of the Nazi state was inevitable. German cities were burning, transportation networks were shattered, and entire armies were surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. Yet even as victory loomed, the most consequential decisions of the war were still being made. Not on the battlefield, but in conference rooms, telegrams, and political agreements that would determine the shape of Europe for generations. At the center of one of the most controversial decisions stood General George S. Patton, a commander whose armies were racing across Germany faster than anyone believed possible, and who was stopped not by German resistance, but by Allied politics. By early 1945, Patton's Third Army had become a phenomenon. After breaking out of Normandy the previous summer, it had crossed France, smashed through the Siegfried Line, and surged into the heart of Germany. Entire German divisions collapsed in its path. Patton's commanders often woke up unsure where the front line was, because by the time maps were updated, his armored columns were already beyond them. The German army, once feared across the world, was now a retreating mass of exhausted men and broken machines. Patton believed the war could be ended quickly if the Allies struck deep and fast. Above all, he believed that Berlin was the prize that mattered. Berlin was not just another city. It was the symbolic heart of Nazi power, the seat of Hitler's regime, and the place where the war in Europe would end in the public imagination. Whoever captured Berlin would claim the psychological victory, the image of triumph that would define the end of the conflict. Patton understood this instinctively. To him, Berlin was not just a political symbol, it was a military objective. He argued that the Third Army, already deep in central Germany, could reach the city before the Soviets if allowed to continue its advance. By March of 1945, Patton's forward units were less than 200 miles from Berlin. German resistance in his sector was crumbling. Bridges were falling into Allied hands intact. Prisoners poured in by the tens of thousands. Patton's intelligence officers reported that the Germans no longer had coherent defensive lines between his spearheads and the capital. In Patton's mind, the road was open. He believed that stopping would be a historic mistake. But the war was no longer being decided solely by generals in the field. Months earlier, at a conference in the Crimean resort of Yalta, the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had made agreements that quietly sealed Berlin's fate. Germany, once defeated, would be divided into occupation zones. Berlin, though located deep inside the Soviet zone, would itself be divided among the Allies. This arrangement assumed that Soviet forces would capture the city. No one at Yalta had seriously considered the possibility that American armies might reach Berlin first. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, supreme Allied commander in Europe, understood the political weight of these agreements. His mission, as he saw it, was not to win glory or symbols, but to defeat Germany as quickly and efficiently as possible, while preserving Allied unity. By the spring of 1945, Eisenhower believed Berlin no longer held strategic value. Germany's armies were collapsing everywhere. The capture of industrial regions and the destruction of remaining German forces mattered more than possession of a devastated city that would soon be handed to the Soviets anyway. Eisenhower also faced grim arithmetic. Intelligence estimates suggested that an assault on Berlin could cost tens of thousands of casualties. The city had been fortified, filled with desperate defenders, and prepared for street fighting. Eisenhower did not believe it was worth sacrificing American lives for territory already promised to another ally. To him, Berlin was a political target, not a military necessity. When Eisenhower informed his commanders of his intention to halt the Western advance short of Berlin, the reaction was explosive. British leaders, especially Winston Churchill, were alarmed. Churchill believed that allowing the Soviets to take Berlin uncontested would hand Stalin enormous leverage in post-war negotiations. He warned that whoever occupied Berlin would shape the narrative of victory and dominate Central Europe. To Churchill, Berlin was the key to limiting Soviet influence. Once lost, it could never be reclaimed. Patton shared Churchill's fears. though he expressed them far more bluntly. He believed the Soviet Union was not a true ally but a future enemy. He warned that every mile conceded to the Red Army would be paid for later in blood and freedom. Patton openly argued that the Western Allies should race the Soviets to Berlin, occupy as much territory as possible, and dictate the terms of peace from a position of undeniable strength. But Patton was not the man making the final decision. Eisenhower was under immense pressure to maintain Allied cooperation. The war against Japan still loomed, and American planners believed Soviet participation would be crucial in defeating Japanese forces in Asia. Alienating Stalin by violating agreements over Berlin could jeopardize that cooperation. Eisenhower chose unity over rivalry in late March. Eisenhower sent word to Soviet leadership outlining his intention to drive southeast toward Leipzig and into southern Germany rather than north toward Berlin. Stalin replied calmly, stating that Soviet forces would handle Berlin. The message appeared to confirm that the capital was no longer a priority for the Western Allies. With that exchange, the fate of Berlin was effectively sealed. Orders went out to American commanders to halt at the Elbe River. The line was drawn. Patton's Third Army, despite its momentum, was ordered to stop. Tanks that could have driven east instead turned south or simply waited. To Patton, it was unbearable. He believed the enemy was broken and that history was slipping through their fingers. In April, the Red Army unleashed its final offensive against Berlin. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops surged forward under massive artillery barrages that turned entire neighborhoods into rubble. The fighting was savage and relentless. Soviet soldiers paid a terrible price, but they advanced street by street until the city collapsed. By early May, the Soviet flag flew over the ruins of the Reichstag. The image circled the world. In the eyes of millions, the Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany. American troops did eventually enter Berlin, but only after the fighting had ended. Their presence was ceremonial, governed by occupation agreements rather than conquest. When American leaders stood in the ruined city later that summer, they did so as administrators, not victors. Patton was among them, standing in a city he believed he should have taken by force. The decision to keep Patton out of Berlin had consequences far beyond wounded pride. It shaped the political landscape of post-war Europe. With Soviet forces occupying Berlin and much of Eastern Europe, communist governments soon emerged across the region. Germany itself was divided into East and West, with Berlin becoming the most visible fault line of the Cold War. Walls, barbed wire, and armed guards would later cut the city in two, a direct result of who arrived there first in 1945. Patton did not remain silent. He criticized Soviet behavior openly and condemned the policies that allowed former Nazi officials to be removed from power in the West while remaining in place under Soviet supervision in the East. His blunt language and refusal to soften his views made him a political liability. By the autumn of 1945, Patton was relieved of command. Officially, it was for his outspoken remarks. Unofficially, it was because he no longer fit the carefully managed political order of the post-war world. Patton died later that year in a car accident, never seeing how fully his fears would materialize. Within a few years, Europe was divided by ideology. Armies faced each other across fortified borders, and Berlin became the epicenter of global tension. Airlifts, blockades, and confrontations followed, all rooted in the decisions made at the war's end. Historians continue to debate whether allowing the Soviets to take Berlin was a mistake. Some argue that Eisenhower saved countless American lives and preserved Allied unity when it mattered most. Others believe the decision handed Stalin a strategic and psychological victory that shaped decades of conflict. What cannot be denied is that the choice was not made on the battlefield. It was made in the realm of politics, diplomacy, and long-term calculation. George Patton was kept out of Berlin not because he lacked the ability to reach it, but because the war had already moved beyond the limits of military logic. The armies were still fighting, but the future was being negotiated. The city that symbolized the rise of Nazi Germany also became the symbol of a divided world. And the general who raced faster than any other across Europe was forced to stop watching as history turned in a direction he had warned against. In the end, Berlin did not fall to the fastest army or the boldest commander. It fell according to agreements signed months earlier, shaped by fear, compromise, and political necessity. The decision to halt Patton at the Elbe did not just end a campaign, it changed the balance of power in Europe, defined the opening chapter of the Cold War, and ensured that the victory over Nazi Germany would be followed immediately by a new and dangerous struggle.